Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Death of Death, where we proclaim Christ's victory over sin, death, and everything else. I am your host, as always, Nick Stewart. Big episode today. Had to postpone last week because I was working so hard on it. But before we get to that, got a few orders of business to get to. Want to give a shout out to our newest patrons, Chris Jameson and Cole Cleveland. Thank you guys for showing your support for the show. You can join these guys in supporting the show by going to patreon.com/deathofdeath, or you can go to deathofdeath.net and click the big Patreon button on the menu. Patrons get the episodes a few days early, whenever possible. Get an exclusive episode once a month, and again, when possible, vote on the topics of future episodes. Right now, for the Elect Exclusive Edition, the podcast we do just on Patreon, we're going through atheist Christopher Hitchens' book, God is Not Great, and we've only been at it for one chapter, so if you want to sign up and get yourself a copy of the book, you can be a part of our little book club. So thanks again, guys, for signing up. Helps the show. Now, some not-so festive stuff to have to address here. There is some bad news in the Death of Death family. Good friend of the show and frequent guest, one of my best friends on the planet, Trevor Wright, was unfortunately diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer. Anyone who has heard his appearances here before knows that he had stage 3 a few years back, and he beat it really hard. But unfortunately, a few weeks ago, they found that it had metastasized to his lungs, so that's not what you want to hear. I know he would really appreciate your prayers, so please join me and his other friends and family in praying for him without ceasing. Trevor, if you're listening, man, I love you. I'm here for anything you need. I'm putting a link in the episode description for Trevor's GoFundMe page to help pay for his treatments. So please, please, please click that and give what you can. And for you patrons, all of your Patreon support for the month of January went to that GoFundMe. But please, if there's anything more you can give, do so. I'll be giving you updates on Trevor's situation as we go. I assume, since he has some of the highest rated episodes, that you guys want to hear how it's going. Please, if you pray for him, remember to include his wife, Cheryl, because she really needs strength right now. She just had their third baby. And the last time Trevor was going through this, she was pregnant with their second, young Simon. So she's got her hands full, and the weight of the world must really be on her shoulders right now. So if you listen to this podcast, please pray for him. Please donate if you can. The link is at the top of the episode description. It's also on the homepage of the website. So if you go to deathofdeath.net, you'll see Trevor and Cheryl, picture of Trevor and Cheryl and the kids, and you can click that and it'll take you right to it. Maybe he'll even come on the show and give an update if he's feeling up to it. So today we are doing a Patreon pick for the topic today. Some history of Christianity and science. I had to change it to some history because you can't possibly cover all of this in one episode, or even a book probably. You can join the Elect and vote for upcoming episodes by going to patreon.com/deathofdeath. You know all that already. It's just $4 a month. Then you too can vote for the topics that I'll be covering in future episodes. Doug Stanhope, the stand-up comedian, had a joke that he couldn't believe that some people drove around with a cross and a GPS on the same dashboard. Now, as out of date as that joke may sound now, the sentiment remains, There's this constant dichotomy of faith and science. Some of my favorite TV shows of all time, like Lost and House, were constantly pitting science and religion against each other. Lost even went so far as to have the often repeated dichotomy of man of science or man of faith, as if the two were kind of mutually exclusive. And I hear it said often that the first scientists were Christians, but until now I hadn't, really researched it a whole lot for myself. Jeff Durbin is fond of telling the anecdote of the man who invented anesthesia. We're going to get into that and a few other things today. I researched some of these things that I hear, pretty frequently about the history of Christianity and science for today's episode. But the minute you start researching this, your screen will just be flooded by the names Ronald Numbers and David Lindbergh. It just seems like those guys, in addition to Peter Harrison, are the main authorities on this subject, like from the historical point of view. So I bought a book by Ronald Numbers and David Lindbergh, a book of essays called When Christianity and Science Meet. And I also got the Peter Harrison book titled The Territories of Science and Religion. Those are my main sources of research for this episode today. In addition to so many articles, I'm pretty sure I'm not going to put all of the articles I used in the episode description, but I'll probably put them on the website. So if you go to this episode on the website, you should be able to find those. And I won't be able to cite those books every single time I use them, so I just thought I would tell you the books up front and just know that I'm drawing from those a lot, and those will be in the episode description. So let's start with, what is science? I'm going to use the word science to describe a lot of things in this episode, but it's one of those words that's kind of defined by its context. Science comes from the Latin word scientia. Definitely should have committed that pronunciation to memory. It's probably one of those things that doesn't really matter how you pronounce it. Scientia or scientia, which means knowledge. So in the most basic sense, we're talking about knowledge or having knowledge. Science can also refer to the scientific method. The scientific method is making an observation, forming a theory about the observation, and then repeating and testing that theory. So when I say science, I could also be referring to the scientific community, which would be like, the foremost scientists of a certain period, or, geography, and perhaps even, the mechanisms by which they're funded, and some of the ideas and methods that are common among them. Natural philosophy was the name for what we'd probably call natural science today. It wasn't until really the 1800s that natural philosophy started being called science, so I may refer to it that way as well. Although there's a few different names for that word, science, by now they've become a sort of amalgamation of all those meanings. I'm sure my context won't ever be lost on you, but I did want to, just say up front that there's not one specific definition for science at all times. It's kind of a contextual thing. It used to just kind of be a habit of the mind or an intellectual rigor, but has now, kind of come to be synonymous with a certain set of beliefs, even if the evidence doesn't really support it. Climate change is science now, and evolution is science now, but it used to be synonymous with a method. It used to be a discipline, Now it's become more a set of beliefs, not unlike a religion. I was listening to the podcast Stuff You Should Know, which is a wonderfully informative podcast about every topic under the sun. And one of the hosts mentioned the Dark Ages and said that the Dark Ages was Christianity telling science to go to hell. And they basically said that humanity suffered for centuries as a result of that, and I was struck by how nuanced and unbiased that statement was. And if you didn't pick up on the sarcasm in that statement, then this episode is going to be very informative for you. And we're going to talk about the Dark Ages among many other topics on the show today. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the conflict thesis. Let's start with that. The conflict thesis maintains that religion and science are irreconcilable, and therefore there will always be hostility between them. However, this type of conflict didn't seem to exist prior to the 1800s, which of course is sandwiched between the Enlightenment period and the publishing of Charles Darwin's Origin of Species, which would both go a far way in undermining the way people had seen the world since the beginning of time. The most prominent exponent of the conflict thesis was a scientist named John William Draper, who wrote in 1874, "The history of science is not a mere record of isolated discoveries. It is a narrative of the conflict of two contending powers, the expansive force of the human intellect on one side, and the compression arising from traditionary faith and human interests on the other." It doesn't seem like there's any particular moment in history when this became the consensus. However, I would point to this era after the Enlightenment and prior to the popularization of Darwinian macroevolution as the focal point of religion and science kind of being torn away from each other. And then, the controversies with evolution were definitely like the fatal blow that kind of brought us to where we are today. Contemporary devotees of the conflict thesis would include anyone under the banner of the New Atheism. Foremost among them, by my estimation, would be Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins. In the exposition of those two men, the false dilemma of faith and reason is pretty much the bedrock of their arguments. In the rise of the conflict thesis, you begin to see this false dilemma really take hold on the consciousness of the scientific community. And then in the 1970s, Frank Turner published a book titled Between Science and Religion, and this is considered the turning point when the conflict thesis was no longer really accepted as fact, but, kind of more of an ongoing discussion. I tend to disagree with that. I feel like most people still pretty much pit religion and science against each other. Peter Harrison, the historian of science that I mentioned earlier, has spilled a lot of ink to explain that the categories of science and religion are relatively new and that there wasn't always a dichotomy like that. He says that science, which means knowledge, and religion, which means sacred things, amounts to inner qualities of a person and not entities that can be set at war with one another. It's the people behind those things that create the conflict. He believes that science used to be considered a habit of mind, but has now come to refer to specific sets of beliefs. Now, whatever you think of his thesis, it's certainly interesting to think that we didn't always view the natural and the supernatural as distinct and opposing things. And that's just one of the many ways we'll see today that biblical authority and scientific discovery were never really at odds with one another. And even today, the only conflict between them is artificially created. So, on to the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. Prior to the Enlightenment, God, or at least his providence, was kind of just a given to most people. There were always scruples between different religions and sects, but the Enlightenment fundamentally changed how people saw the world. When I read about American history, it seems providence was a huge part of life. It was by providence that a battle might be won, or providence that rescue might arrive on time. Providence, of course, means God's personal care and intervention for the world at large. People back then just had more trust in God's control over things, and it was just a given that there was a creator who had a say in how our lives were lived and how they turned out. Post-Enlightenment, things like that could no longer really be taken for granted. Everything had to be questioned. The Enlightenment came at the tail end of a period that's come to be known as the Scientific Revolution, which is considered to begin in 1543 with the publication of Nicholas Copernicus's book on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres, and continued through to the end of the 1700s. although most consider this era to be a turning point in science and religion being at odds. A lot of the founding members of the Royal Society, which is a, learned society of UK academics even to this day, they had a lot of close ties to the Puritans. And in fact, most of the members of that society were Christians themselves, and they were kind of the elite scientists, like the highest, rank of scientists of the day. The 1700s is where we see the rise of the scientific method, which, if you had to define science, that would probably be the best definition. The scientific method is observing and repeating something. It's a methodology, It shows the switch in the consciousness of the scientific community from deductive experimentation to inductive experimentation, which was as good as it was bad for the relationship of science and religion. The inductive philosophy was all about abandoning all presuppositions and anything you knew before and let the results of the experiment speak for themselves. Where before, in the deductive philosophy of science, it was all about using experiments to further your understanding of already established facts. So likewise, empiricism became the norm in the scientific world, which meant that knowledge only came from sensory experience, and only things you could experience personally could be true for you. And we've talked about things like this on the show before. It's called the philosophical bias. But things like God and providence and objective morality, they used to be a given, but they were kind of taken for granted by science. And a scientist would go into an experiment with these existing facts, hoping to further his understanding of them by discovering something new, some new information. But that's where I believe the change in science really took place, when things we already believed, things we always believed about the world, had to be abandoned in favor of the inductive philosophy of science. We were starting from what we could prove with facts and figures, with experimentation, and things like God, love, morality. All of these immaterial things could no longer be taken seriously, because how do you prove that from the bottom up? Despite the fact that we are aware of the existence of these things in our everyday lives, there's no fact or figure that can really prove them. So they said. With the deductive philosophy, you can study nature to further your understanding of an already established fact, like the fact that God created everything. But with the inductive philosophy, you have to rely on a more naturalistic worldview, which, of course, we see dominating the world of science today. So on to the Merton thesis. The Merton thesis is the argument that Protestantism was ingrained in early scientific experimentation, and that ultimately science and religion are not at odds with one another. Protestantism, the theory goes, had the type of intellectual freedom that was able to lead to the early advances of modern science, whereas Catholicism was more centered on obedience to the church, which did not foster that type of advancement. However, a lot of historians point out that the Catholic Church was never very hostile to intellectual pursuits and scientific discovery. You're probably thinking of Galileo right now, and we're going to talk about that a little later, so just hold tight. There is something about the idea that Protestantism leads to more advancements in science than Catholicism. Predominantly, Protestant nations undeniably lead the way in scientific innovation. Gerhard Lenski wrote a book defending the Merton thesis, and he says, recently, as of 1963, some Brazilian Catholic social scientists compared their country's progress with that of the United States and concluded that the chief factor responsible for the differential rates of development is the religious heritage of the two nations. So take that for what it's worth. I did read an economic article that was trying to explain this phenomenon, and the point that they made was education as the reason why this might be a fact. And it's not that Catholics aren't educated or haven't always kind of led the way in education. The Protestant Reformation encouraged people to study the Bible for themselves and that resulted in many schools for the purpose of teaching religion. And we'll see later that most major universities were founded to train ministers and missionaries. But one way in which Protestants were different was that a larger percentage of girls went to school than in the Catholic tradition, which means more people in general were being educated in Protestant societies and therefore started to outpace the Catholics on scientific innovation. Peter Harrison has noted that natural science began as man taking back dominion over creation, which was lost at the fall. And I love that. Today we still refer to the laws of nature, and originally the term was understood to mean things that were set in place by a divine hand. Law kind of implies someone is imposing it. There was a concept of God's two books, the book of the Bible and the book of nature, and we see a similar dichotomy in the doctrines of general and special revelation. General revelation is comprised of things like creation, logic, reason, the human conscience, things like that. And special revelation is found in the person of Jesus Christ and the written word of Scripture. Both categories reveal different things about God to various degrees, but general revelation acknowledges that God is separate from creation and can't be known to the extent that he is in Scripture just by observing nature. It seems that the Protestants' rigorous biblical interpretation as an academic exercise laid the groundwork for rigorous experimentation and theorization in empirical modern science. So similarly, Protestantism is largely credited with the widespread reading that we see in North America, which originated in personal Bible study. So moving on to some common historical myths. This is the fun part. The entire history of Christianity and science has sort of become a myth at this point because it's so widely held that Christianity has been a stifler of scientific innovation throughout the centuries, which is simply just not true. Augustine said that all truth is God's truth, so anywhere philosophy may stumble on truth, we kind of have to steal it from them as if they were like unlawful possessors of the truth. All truth is Christian truth. So later, when we get into notable scientists who were Christian, we'll see that science wouldn't be where it is today without Christianity. And by the way, did you see how far out of my way I went to not call them Christian scientists? Because that's something else now. First, let's talk about the flat earth theory. I'm not going to talk much about the theorists themselves, but just to put to bed right here and now whether the Bible teaches it and whether early Christians believed it. The theory of a flat earth has had a resurgence, which is a sentence I can't believe I just uttered in 2021. But before that, it was more of an insult than anything, and it would kind of be lobbed by like the non-Christian to the Christian, and the implication was that Christianity always held these outdated and disproven beliefs like the earth being flat. And it was kind of more of a mischaracterization and an insult than anything. It wasn't really as if anyone believed that. From what I've been able to find, spherical earth theories, that's a band name, and I just called it. That's my new band. Spherical earth theories were present as early as Pythagoras, which would be approximately 400 BC, and they spread, and there's no real sign of that consensus ever changing. Like, doubtless there were people who believed in a flat earth, as there are even to this day, strangely, but we have to consider the overall consensus, and especially what the church believed. It seems that the church never held this view out of vogue, if it ever did really at all. Isaiah 40:22 says, "It is he who sits above the circle of the earth." So a spherical earth is not and never has been in opposition to the Bible. In fact, the Bible seems to say that. So I think at this point, some read the behavior of contemporary Christians back into Christians throughout history. So if Christians are just those people who want to put parental advisory stickers on records, which was done by your government and not by Christians, by the way, then it's easy to believe that Christians have always been these lame, repressive jerks throughout history. And it's easier to believe that the Bible teaches flat Earth, or the church excommunicated Galileo for his cosmological views, or whatever, the thing is. The historian of science, I've mentioned many times already, David C. Lindbergh, addresses the notion of Christianity being a source of repression and anti-science throughout the medieval period, mostly as a myth. He says that Christianity in general has always supported critical thinking. That doesn't mean there aren't some examples of repression in history, but I wouldn't advise any atheist to take the high ground on that one, just saying. According to David Lindbergh and Ronald Numbers, there was scarcely a Christian scholar of the Middle Ages who did not acknowledge Earth's sphericity and even know its approximate circumference. And historian R. Hoykas? I got no idea. Hooykaas. Hoykas. I'm just going to say Hoykas. I christen you Hoykas. R. Hoykas said regarding the biblical influence on science that, metaphorically speaking, whereas the bodily ingredients of science may have been Greek, its vitamins and hormones were biblical. I love how he felt the need to say metaphorically speaking, as if everyone wasn't going to understand what he meant by that. Even Augustine viewed the natural sciences as a tool to be used for understanding God's creation. And I feel like we kind of veered away from, flat earth stuff for a minute just now. I did want to circle back around to that and just say I'm pretty convinced at this point that the flat earth conspiracies were literally started by atheists and spread among Christians in order to make Christians look stupid, because I literally cannot figure out the exact origin of it and like how it caught on and like why it became a thing and why it's mostly a Christian thing. Like, I've seen videos of Christian, evangelists that are like yelling about the flat earth and saying that it's the gospel and stuff. So, I mean, I don't know why, but I have a sneaking suspicion that it started from atheists as a satire and caught on as a real thing. But it turns out that, most of these stories about the churches dealing with science in the Middle Ages are super off kilter. According to James Hannam, author of the book The Genesis of Science, the church was the main funder of science until the French Revolution. Now, I'm sure anytime someone is funding science, it always offers its fair share of conflicts of interest, but you cannot convince me for 1 second that there's any comparison between that and the type of bad information that U.S. government-funded science is cranking out today. So, I mean, after all, we did just change everything we believed about immunology and virology, so take that for what it's worth. In addition to the church being the main funder of science historically, Hannam doubles down and says that classical Christian education always included science and mathematics to a compulsory degree. It seems the church has always taken science pretty seriously from what I'm seeing. Likewise, it turns out that the controversy of Copernicus is a little blown out of proportion. The concept of the galaxy not revolving around the Earth wasn't really as controversial back then as we may think. It's going to get complicated around the time of Galileo because it's going to be condemned as a heresy, so then it becomes a political issue. But theologically speaking, the earth was fallen and the heavens were considered to be the location of perfection. Therefore, the earth and other planets revolving around something in the heavens, so to speak, fit, right in line with the thinking of the day. So not to say that incident was completely without controversy, that would be rewriting history, but a lot of that debacle has been debunked as a myth, and we'll talk about that more when we get to Galileo in a moment. So once again, according to James Hannam, the idea that Christianity was a hindrance to science was completely new to the Enlightenment period, and he kind of paints that as a propagandizing of history to kind of turn political opinion away from Christianity. The medieval era, being characterized as the Dark Ages, is a caricature that has long since been disproven. Critical reflection about the nature of the world was always tolerated and even encouraged in most cases. Theology and religion were regarded as legitimate participants and components in the investigation of truths about the natural world far more frequently than they are today. They were kind of partners in that. Here's what you need to remember about the Dark Ages. Voltaire was quoted as saying that it was a time of barbarism, superstition, and ignorance that covered the face of the world. But in reality, people say the same thing about the present day. So how does it differ? Like, that sounds like something that people would say about the Trump administration. So, like, were the Dark Ages really all that dark? We are living in the most advanced society ever to exist on the planet. Technology, human rights, world hunger, all of these things are better than they've ever been before. But when they write the history books about this period of America, people are going to think we weren't allowed to read, and that there were like cages on every street corner where we kept little Mexican kids, and you could pay a nickel to poke them with a stick, and we had a weekly gay bash at every city hall. Like, the way people talk about our society today makes it sound even worse than how the Dark Ages are characterized, and all that to say, like, just because some people say that a time period was ignorant or generally bad or whatever the accusation is, it doesn't mean they were 100% accurate. So there were scientific advancements made throughout the Dark Ages, just like every other period of history. And the difference is that these advances were made in universities funded by the church. It is theorized that the Enlightenment brought on this kind of anti-church propaganda, which led to myths about Christianity squashing scientific advancement throughout history. It's a myth that persists to this very day. And the so-called Dark Ages are a time period that brought us universities, water and windmills, Gothic architecture, heavy plows, cannons, and musical notation. And that's just to name a few things. Those are just the ones that I liked. Cannons and musical notation and Gothic architecture. Those are the things I like. So let's finally get into the Galileo controversy. Finally, time to talk about Galileo. I would have saved this for the portion of the show where we're going to talk about notable people, but it seems more appropriate to talk about him in the myth section, because we're going to be doing some myth busting. And by understanding this, you'll understand pretty much everything you need to know about the man. The time of Galileo was the 1500s. The Catholic Church ruled Italy for the most part. Since the 4th century, geocentric cosmology had been the primary view. This meant that the solar system revolved around the Earth. Part of this was because the sun was considered a planet at the time, and part of it was that it appeared to revolve around the Earth every day. I mean, we do say sunrise and sunset, right? That was until 1543, when Nicholas Copernicus wrote about heliocentric cosmology in his book on the revolutions of the celestial orbs. Gosh, I wish our science books were still called stuff like that. Heliocentric meant that the solar system revolved around the sun and not the Earth. Galileo became interested in cosmology about a year after the invention of the telescope in 1608, so he didn't waste any time there. He was a curious trailblazer from the beginning. He was always on Copernicus' side of the debate, though at times he claimed to be undecided in order to avoid punishment from the church. Yep, that's pretty much proven. He argued that the topography of the Earth was similar to that of the moon from what he could observe in his telescope, and the moon moves, therefore the Earth could also move. It seems so rudimentary looking back on it, but you have to remember what resources they had to work with back then. Like, how are you going to decide which thing is moving, you or the sun? Like, I don't know, with a telescope, like, how are you, so that argument sounds funny, but it's actually a pretty logical argument from what he's working with. So really the issue was he had arguments for heliocentricity. That's your $5 word for today. Heliocentricity. The idea that the Earth moves around the sun, but he didn't necessarily have proof. They were mainly rhetorical points, not really like a hard science. A little before Copernicus's heyday, the Protestant Reformation had taken place, which led the Catholic Church to take dissenting opinions a lot more seriously, because on the political side of things, that could mean a serious blow to their power if they didn't save some face and squash some dissension. So they were kind of politically motivated to punish Galileo from the beginning, but it was unclear to me exactly what got Galileo in trouble in the first place, like whether it was like a published work or just word kind of got around that Galileo was arguing for a heliocentric solar system. I think it's the latter. I think it was just a word of mouth thing. Whatever the case, Galileo traveled to Rome in 1611 to argue for his findings. The Jesuits, to whom he presented his case, confirmed his observations, but not necessarily his interpretations. So they basically said, like, yep, we see the point you're making. Not so sure if you're interpreting your findings right, but your findings are valid, you know? So this trip to Rome amounted to pretty much nothing. No controversy really surrounded it. He was forbidden to teach a heliocentric view, but not forbidden to write about it, as long as it was hypothetical and theoretical. It just couldn't be a plain statement of fact. So that left Galileo with a lot of room to work with. You know, he published 2 books, The Starry Messenger in 1610 and Letters on the Sunspots in 1613. The heliocentric view wasn't condemned as a heresy until 3 years later in 1616. Retroactively, some of Galileo's books now were considered heresy, and he didn't go quite far enough in stating the heliocentric view as a theory and not a fact, and it seemed to the readers that he was very much confident in this view, and he was teaching it with authority. So he makes a second trip to Rome to correct the accusations against him, and it stirred up even more controversy than the first one. Hanging around at the time, just sort of in the air, was a false report that Galileo had written a horoscope of Urban VIII's death. Urban VIII was the Pope at the time, so this false rumor created a lot of political agitation in the situation that was already a little weird. There were a litany of other things going on politically also, but it involves a lot of names and political discourse, and I don't understand all of it, and it's just kind of boring. So all we need to know is there were a lot of political things going on, a lot of motives at play that made the church feel like they really had to make an example of Galileo. So he was condemned for heresy, even though he maintained that he never confidently believed the heliocentric view, but was merely analyzing the arguments. He spent the rest of his life under house arrest. Not free, but not really imprisoned either. He never wrote on cosmology again, but continued to write about other scientific subjects. Galileo was always open to debating scripture. You know, he didn't see what he was teaching as being against scripture. However, I think he was wrong in his assessment of the Bible's content on scientific matters. He said that the Bible might not be accurate in scientific things, but only in things that pertain to salvation. These opinions were also the source of a lot of controversy, but I've always loved the assessment from Don Stewart, of all people. You didn't think I was going to quote Don Stewart today, did you? But he said that the Bible is a non-scientific book, but that doesn't make it an unscientific book. You know, it may not go out of its way to explain scientific things, but that doesn't mean it's wrong about scientific things. The reality is that heliocentricity is a proven fact now. But back then, on the side of geocentrism, there seemed to be some pretty clear Bible passages. You know, for the heliocentric view, there were only what seemed to be arguments and opinions. It's easy to read a lot of ignorance back into history, but it's just not that simple, you know? Back to the issue of the Bible's authority on these matters, is the Bible wrong to call it sunrise and sunset? I don't think so. because we all believe in the heliocentric view now, but we still call it sunrise and sunset. Is the Bible wrong to use idioms and expressions that we still use today? I submit that it is not. It doesn't mean that the biblical authors knew the earth revolved around the sun, but it also doesn't mean the Bible was wrong. It's just an idiom. So, like Don Stewart said, the Bible isn't a scientific textbook, but that doesn't mean it's actually wrong about anything it says. The term sunrise isn't necessarily support for a geocentric solar system. So at the end of the day, Galileo's condemnation was mostly political. This event is often portrayed as science versus Christianity and organized religion stifling scientific innovation. The reality is that every single person involved in this situation claimed to be a Christian and believed in the authority of the Bible, even Galileo. This is not an issue of an irreconcilable difference between the Bible and science. Virtually every Christian today is a heliocentrist. So if the Bible really had a lot to say about that, we wouldn't be, I don't think. And even at the time of Galileo's trial, there were many Christians who were heliocentrists already. So the myth is busted, but we're going to see that the Scopes trial was something a little closer to what people believe Galileo's trial was. The Scopes trial. It's not really a myth like some of the other things we've covered, but it's definitely risen to mythical proportions. The year was 1925, and a law was passed in Tennessee known as the Butler Act, which forbade the teaching of human evolution in public schools. The ACLU found this law unconstitutional and offered to assist any teacher in Tennessee who would challenge the law in court. This teacher would end up being John T. Scopes, but it wasn't quite as simple as him accepting the offer from the ACLU. It was actually two local businessmen, one of which was also the head of the school board, who decided it would be great publicity for their town. So they recruited Scopes, even though he wasn't the biology teacher. The principal of the school was actually the biology teacher, but Scopes had filled in for him various times. So he was actually the physics and math teacher and also the football coach. These businessmen got Scopes to agree to admitting that he had taught evolution so that he would be charged, and then they could fight the law in court. And he agreed that it would be good publicity and didn't have much to lose because he was young, single, and the maximum fine for this was $500, which was a lot back then, but it wouldn't ruin you for life if you had to pay that. Part of the myth of this trial actually comes from the play and the movie it inspired, both titled Inherit the Wind, 1955 and 1960 respectively. That depiction of the story showed a mob throwing a teacher in jail for teaching evolution. This is not really how it happened. The teachers were required to teach from a book that taught evolution. Therefore, the teachers were required to break the law, which is just another reason why government is pointless. Scopes got some of his students to testify against him to the grand jury, and he was arrested. He was immediately bailed out by the owner of a newspaper, which follows since this was basically a giant publicity stunt. And it worked. It dominated the headlines. For the small town of Dayton, it was a media circus. There were over 200 reporters covering it in the courtroom and thousands of people flocking to the courthouse to see it happen. The trial began with Clarence Darrow acting as defense attorney and William Jennings Bryan acting as prosecutor. Darrow was an agnostic and Bryan was a Christian. So the defense had 15 different expert witnesses made up of both evolutionists and religious people who were willing to testify against the constitutionality of the Butler Act, which was the law against teaching evolution in schools. They were ultimately dismissed, but they were allowed to submit written statements to be used in the trial. Toward the end of the trial, and the trial went on for 8 days, the defense called none other than William Jennings Bryan, the prosecuting attorney, to be a religious expert and to take the stand. So what you had is the defense attorney actually questioning the prosecuting attorney. So this testimony had nothing to do with the constitutionality of the law or the question of whether Scopes had broken that law, and it's been described more as a religious debate, and it went on for 2 hours. So I gotta say up front, I actually appreciate most of the answers that Brian gave in the transcripts that I read of it. Clarence Darrow ended up asking Brian if he believed that the story of Jonah and the whale was true, if Jonah was in the belly of the whale for 3 days. And Brian replied, and in my opinion, very well. I wish I had answers like this. He said, "I believe God made man and God made whales, and he can make them do as he pleases." When asked if Brian ever learned where Cain found his wife, he responded, "No, sir. I leave the agnostics to hunt for her." Just school him. Just dismiss him like the little runt that he is. He admits at some point that the days in the creation account in Genesis could represent periods of time and not necessarily 24-hour days, which is when he is considered to have lost this debate. Many interpreted this as Brian not caring about the critical issues, but this is actually a common view of the creation account. Court was adjourned for the day when Brian and Darrow started shaking their fists at each other, and the interrogation was never allowed to continue. The judge ruled the entire argument irrelevant. I only wonder why it took him so long to reach that conclusion. It's like no one could remember what this trial was actually supposed to be about. In the myths of this trial, and even in the play, which titled Inherit the Wind, Brian is portrayed as a fool who can't string a sentence together, really, and he literally cries for his mother by the end of the interrogation. While everyone is laughing at him, he's portrayed as believing, the fines for breaking the law weren't steep enough. And, that's actually the point of the trial, was whether or not the law was broken. In reality, Brian appears to be a very smart, articulate man who didn't support any punishment above a fine, not even an arrest. And, just a little point of trivia, he did die just 5 days after this trial from a heart attack, and nobody really knows why, but they do think the trial may have been a contributing factor. So the trial was about the constitutionality of the law against teaching evolution. It seems that was hardly ever considered in the actual trial, and it was without question that Scopes had taught evolution, so obviously the 8-day trial ended with the jury deliberating for 9 minutes, and they found Scopes guilty, resulting in a fine of $100. So it seems that the complicated legacy of this trial was just as convoluted while the trial was actually happening as it has become in popular culture since then. The trial was never about whether evolution was true or not, or whether the Bible was true or not, or whether those things contradicted each other. It was whether Scopes broke the law, which he did, and he was challenging the constitutionality of that law. Both sides consider themselves the winners in this case, but whatever the case may be, the Butler Act was not repealed until 1967. Now it's time to talk about evolution, and I figured the Scopes trial was as good a segue as we were going to get for that, but we're going to talk about evolution and the age of the Earth. Did you think we weren't going to talk about evolution at all? I mean, it's impossible. When you think about the antagonism between science and Christianity, you immediately go to evolution. It's widely considered scientific fact, although there are some dissenters that seem to be silenced immediately. And for certain groups of Christians, they feel they cannot forfeit any ground to that theory whatsoever. They feel to do so is a betrayal of their faith. And then, of course, there are Christians who take the middle ground and accept it. As the walls closed in and the scientific community became more and more antagonistic toward Christianity, a lot of Christians made the wrong move and essentially decided to be at odds with science. Less intellectual Christians were left with only one option because they couldn't argue against scientific data or findings. They were left with the option of claim faith wherever the evidence doesn't seem to back you up. And this made the Christian community appear to be the enemy of science and vice versa, and adversely probably only strengthened the resolve of the anti-Christian agenda, which was then starting to pervade natural science, resulting in an ever-widening chasm between the two parties, and the rest is history. There's a lot we could say about the triumphs and failures of both sides of this debate, and there are a lot of misconceptions. For instance, if you've ever heard of the Goldilocks zone, Christians have appropriated this to support creationism. It's the concept that we're in the perfect place to harbor life on Earth, and it's just evidence that God put us here intentionally. But it was originally an evolutionary concept, and it was meant to explain that given the perfect atmosphere and positioning of the Earth among all the other planets in existence, life evolving here was a lot more likely than to happen anywhere else. However, young Earth creationists have done a lot of work to poke holes in the dating methods used by evolutionists. So I'm going to talk about dinosaurs. Can we talk about dinosaurs for a minute? Did you think I wasn't going to talk about dinosaurs? There's been a lot of soft tissue found in dinosaur fossils, which leads some to believe that they're not as old as some people think. Notably, in 2005, Mary Schweitzer of North Carolina State University found collagen fibers in the fossilized leg bone of a Tyrannosaurus rex, the most royal and excellent of all dinosaurs. Once they were aware of the presence of soft tissue, they tested other fossils and found in about half of them they had some kind of soft tissue, and some of those went all the way back to the Jurassic period. The explanation being that for 300 years, nobody thought the tissue could be there, so nobody tested for it. Now, it seems, it's there most of the time when you actually search for it, because they actually search for it now. And that leads me to think that we're getting closer and closer to cloning dinosaurs. I don't care what you say. Michael Crichton himself could come back from the dead and tell me it's not possible, and I would laugh in his face and tell him that my faith is stronger than his. Eventually, Schweitzer did present an explanation to the soft tissue. Apparently, a strong presence of iron in certain dinosaurs' bodies would have actually been enough to preserve the tissue for millions of years. Or, the fossils aren't that old. I can't help but feel some bias on this issue from both sides. It's hard for those of us who aren't scientists to decide whether to side with evolutionists or not, because there's explanations on both sides that seem entirely plausible, but also entirely biased to their positions, as long as some stuff that's not so easy to accept for most people. It could be the iron preserving them for millions of years, or you could only be theorizing that because you're already presupposing that they are millions of years old, which means there has to be an explanation for that, and you found one. But what if they're not? What if there is some iron preserving them, but they are only 6,000 or 7,000 years old? Nobody's old enough to know how long iron can preserve that. On the specific issues of dating things like fossils and artifacts, I'm at the point now where I don't think either side will ever have definitive proof, because no one is old enough to say what happened at least thousands of years ago, and at most billions of years ago. No one is old enough to definitively say how long it takes for soft tissue to degrade, or how long iron could preserve it. We're only guessing that iron could preserve soft tissue for millions of years. Like, how could you possibly extrapolate that from the observations you can make in an 80-year lifetime? Some believe the Bible gives us a clear timeline of things, but it's really not as clear as it seems. People use genealogies in the Bible to calculate timelines. But when you compare some genealogies, occasionally a few generations are missing. And I'm not saying this is an error. I don't believe the Bible contains any errors. But just, kind of as an example, let's say my great-great-grandfather, Rudolf Schiffman, begot his daughter, whose name escapes me, and she begot my grandfather, Rudolf Stewart, who begot my father, Doug Stewart, and he begot me, Nick Stewart. But if you wanted to say Rudolf Schiffman begot Nick Stewart, that isn't really wrong. Leaving out certain information is not in itself an error. If you said that and people assumed that Rudolf Schiffman was my dad, then they just erased probably 100 years of history from my family tree, maybe more, probably more than 100 years. So you can imagine how these types of presumptions could disrupt timelines in the Bible just a little bit. Again, I'm not saying the Bible is wrong. I think us assuming that these are fathers and sons and not just notable people in the genealogy could lead us to making an error. It could lead us to making an error, not the Bible. You know, some of those guys might be great-grandfathers and great-grandsons. Like, who knows if they're all father and son. So my overall feelings is I'm not an evolutionist, but the age of the earth is an entirely different issue in my eyes. You know, take ice cores, for instance. They use ice cores to date things, kind of like rings on a tree. Certain amount of ice cores correspond to a certain amount of time. But they found a World War II plane in Greenland, and it was under, it was under basically what's supposed to be about 100,000 years worth of ice. A World War II plane under 100,000 years worth of ice. So it's like, none of this, we don't know any of this stuff. Like, none of these dating methods seem to be consistent. So, I mean, there's no way to conclusively prove that it's millions of years old. And, you know, likewise, we're also not old enough to prove that it's only 6,000 or that it's only 10,000 or whatever, you know? So who knows? I love that both sides are investigating and trying to find the answers, but both sides also seem like they're just trying to prove their presuppositions. Either way, it's great fun reading about the things being discovered, but at the end of the day, none of us are old enough to really know for sure. And none of us will live long enough to see if our scientific dating methods even work in the long term. So, that's as good a segue as any to talk about Noah and the flood. The flood narrative was foundational to geology for centuries. By 1700, it was widely accepted that fossils were the remains of antediluvian animals existing before the flood. And later, and even to this day, it's theorized that certain animals became extinct because of the flood. Don Cameron Allen's theory is that too much differing scientific analysis led to the story being abandoned as a legend. Regardless of his point in saying that, I think it's worth pointing out that if that's true, then the differing interpretations of scientific data and the Bible, and not the reliability of the Bible, is what led to it being classified as a legend. Theologians and scientists alike spent many decades, if not centuries, trying to explain how many animals could fit on Noah's Ark. This was the source of a lot of disagreement. It led to a lot of different flood theories, but also a lot of people calculating the size of the ark. Athanasius Kircher was a professor in mathematics who calculated the size of Noah's Ark from the information given in Scripture and determined that Noah could have fit 30 pairs of snakes, 130 pairs of beasts, and 150 pairs of birds on board. I'm going to link to a video in the show notes. It's from Answers in Genesis, and they do the same exact thing Athanasius Kircher did, but I think they do it better. They calculate the size and figure out how many animals could fit, but they did one very important thing differently that I've always been a stickler for whenever this is a conversation. They didn't calculate for every single type of dog and every single type of cat. They calculated for a pair of gray wolves because all dogs come from gray wolves. And if I had it my way, they would have calculated for a pair of Panthera blythe, which is the oldest ancestor of cats that's been found. Fun fact, closest living relative to Panthera blythe is the snow leopard. See, so you don't need 30 types of snakes. All snakes probably come from one kind of snake. So here are some other theories about the flood that came out of trying to make sense of the scientific data. In the 1600s, I tried to learn how to pronounce his name. Isaac de la Pere. It's Perry. I'm going to pronounce it Perry. Isaac de la Perry. It's super French, and my vocal cords don't even work that way. So he's Perry now. Isaac de la Perry began to argue that perhaps the flood was localized. Perhaps only Europe and the Middle East were flooded, while people and animals elsewhere on the planet lived unaffected. And it seems that this more liberal interpretation of the flood account is what opened the door to more secular origin stories for the planet in general. Matthew Hale challenged this theory. He had theorized that animals migrated from all over the planet during the deluge, but he argued against LaPerry and showed the theological problems that it caused, like were pre-Adam humans also divine creation? Like this and many other problems were left unanswered by LaPerry. He also believed that the planet had no beginning and no end, which obviously aided him in some of his more unlikely biblical theories, but it also caused a lot of problems for his logic. So, after a while, it became evident from geological findings that a large body of water had at one point spread across Europe. Seashells were found on mountaintops, and unknown creatures were dug out of the ground, possibly animals that lived before the flood. But the many disagreements about the logistics of the flood, especially when it came to things like the size of the ark and how many animals would have fit on it, led to people abandoning the narrative as an authoritative source at all. Some believed the flood may have been localized. Some believed that the flood was God's way of refitting the earth for a fallen humanity, that it wasn't really a judgment. It was about, remodeling, kind of. And some held that the entire planet actually was flooded as an act of judgment against mankind, just like the Bible says. But no matter the view, it's important to recognize, wrong or right, it was an open discussion in the scientific field. People were not ridiculed for believing the flood happened. Today, it seems even sillier to mock flood believers because we have even more geological evidence for it now than we did back then. But also, because almost every civilization that has ever existed has a flood story. They're not all rooted in the Christian Bible, but doesn't it lend credence to the fact that it happened if most of the world has some version of this story? And it would even fit that they got the story from one source before spreading over the planet and becoming many different societies. And also, just coming to my mind right now, I'm sure the flood would affect our dating of things a lot. I'm sure something as catastrophic as a flood could make something that's 6,000 years old look like it's 2 million years old, So, I don't know. The reality is that there were misconceptions of how the ark needed to operate. There didn't have to be 2 tigers, 2 lions, 2 orange tabbies, 2 cheetahs, so on and so forth. There needed to be 1 kind of cat, and all other cats are descended from those. There only needed to be 2 gray wolves. Instead of assessing the biblical data from this angle, though, scientists tended to compromise what the Bible actually said about the flood and the ark, which led to varying interpretations, which eroded what some considered to be the reliability of the text, which in the eyes of many led to it not being scientifically tenable. However, the scientific investigation into the flood narrative did lead to new observations about comets, earthquakes, rainfall, and of course, geology. So once again, we see that in scientific advancements, Christians were leading the way with a belief that the Bible is true and authoritative. All right, we're going to cover some notable people. Isaac Newton is perhaps the most notable scientist of all time, and unsurprisingly, he was also a Christian. It's been recounted in multiple sources I used for this episode that Newton spent more time studying the apocalyptic books of Scripture than he did doing scientific experiments. He described the universe as a grand mechanism, and that's how he referred to matter in motion, which he considered to be governed by regular mathematical laws. And this led some to believe that he had abandoned his faith in God in favor of a more naturalistic worldview, but in reality, Newton believed that God himself intervened in what he referred to as the grand mechanism. So like I said earlier, the laws of nature imply that there is a lawgiver imposing those things. When early scientists referred to laws, they were often referring to God's order of all things. James Simpson is another notable scientist who was a Christian. I mentioned at the top of the show that general anesthesia was inspired by the Bible, and that turns out to be true. Sir James Young Simpson was a Scottish obstetrician and one of the first men to use chloroform to put someone under for a surgery. He got this idea from reading the Genesis account of the creation of Eve and noticed that God put Adam to sleep before taking his rib. And that made him think that perhaps God was onto something. Perhaps if we have to do something really painful to someone, we should put them to sleep for it. And I think we're all thankful for that. No more taking a shot of whiskey and biting on the old surgery stick. Matthew Maury was one of my favorite people who popped up here. He was an oceanographer in the 1800s who was a devout Christian and believed in the accuracy of the Bible. This led him to make some very important discoveries in his life. After he was discharged from the Navy after an injury, he devoted the rest of his life to studying the sea. One of his most important discoveries was inspired by the words of Psalm 8. The birds of the heavens and the fish of the sea, whatever passes along the paths of the seas. He realized that if the Bible claimed there were paths in the seas, then there very well were. He used old maps and ship logs to determine where currents might be, and then used weighted bottles to measure them. He used the date that the bottles were found and the locations they were found in to make the first ever charts of ocean currents. He wrote a book called The Physical Geography of the Sea and Its Meteorology, which included relevant Bible verses to the things he was explaining, and he later charted the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, which eventually led to cable being laid between Europe and the U.S. Blaise Pascal was a physicist who lived in the 1600s and is most remembered for Pascal's wager. But did you know that he actually invented the first type of calculator? He discovered hydraulics, developed the theory of probability, and also invented the syringe. Roger Bacon was born somewhere between 1214 and 1220. He was educated at the universities of Oxford and Paris. He was one of the first professors to lecture on the scientific works of Aristotle. And at this time, opinions in the church as to whether to teach the classical tradition, like the works of Aristotle, was kind of mixed. People didn't really know if they should be teaching that stuff or not. So the Pope at the time requested that Bacon write 3 treatises on reforming Christian education to be based on the natural sciences, and that contribution to Christian education cannot be overstated. We covered Roger Bacon. Now it's time to talk about Francis Bacon. So much pork on this podcast right now. Francis Bacon lived from the 1560s to the 1620s. He was very serious about scientific pursuits and believed other Christians should be as well. His work on the science of light and vision were influential in the field of optics for the next 350 years after him. So he was no lightweight. He believed the devil would use learning and academia to his own ends, and the church must be well educated in preparation. How true that turned out to be. He also believed that we must have geographical knowledge for the purpose of missionary trips, and he thought that we should have a grasp of history, logic, grammar, mathematics, metaphysics, medicine, natural science, and navigation, all for the purposes of biblical interpretation. He believed that people should not fear investigating natural laws because God largely operates the universe by those laws. He didn't believe these studies would undermine a belief in God. He viewed Scripture as ultimate truth and natural philosophy as something that could be used in light of Scripture. He was very serious about the Bible aiding in scientific interpretation. For example, the rainbow can be explained scientifically, but science fails to give us the real purpose of the rainbow. The purpose of the rainbow is a sign of God's covenant never to flood the earth again. And what is really a rainbow? What is it really? It's infinite reflections and refractions of falling drops of water. So in a rainbow itself, you have a symbol of the flood. and Bacon's work in optics led to this discovery. And, just pointing out, it was thousands of years after the flood narrative was written. So, it could just be one heck of a coincidence that the rainbow was the symbol that God wouldn't flood the earth, or, could be something more than that. And he is quoted as saying, "Every investigation of mankind that is not directed toward salvation is totally blind and leads finally to the darkness of hell." All right, so let's wrap up with a real quick look at the Christian origins of some of the most notable universities. The oldest colleges in Western civilization started out as seminaries. Harvard, Yale, Dartmouth, Princeton, Rutgers, and Oxford all started out as Christian institutions. The stated purpose of Harvard University was to advance learning and perpetuate it to posterity, dreading to leave an illiterate ministry to the churches when our present ministers shall lie in the dust. Many Puritan ministers were trained there. In fact, it wasn't until 1708 when John Leverett became the first president of Harvard to not also be a clergyman. That's when the school took more of a direction away from religion, but it still wouldn't be until the 1800s when that was really solidified, and even later, obviously to get to where we are today. So it's definitely something that happened gradually over time. Princeton was founded by the New Light Presbyterians in 1746 in New Jersey. Its purpose was to mainly train ministers, and I'm starting to see a pattern here. In 1768, John Witherspoon became president and shifted the school's focus into a more secular direction. I'll refrain from listing too much history because this pattern just continues, but I found that Yale was started to train ministers. Dartmouth was started by Eleazar Wheelock to train American Indians to be Christian missionaries. Rutgers was started by ministers of the Dutch Reformed Church in order to have autonomy from the Presbyterian schools, among other denominations. So it's hard to say that Christians have historically been anti-intellectual. The perception of Christians is that they don't encourage free thought or intellectualism, and that they favor faith over and in the face of reason and logic. But history shows us that education and science wouldn't be where it is today without Christians. In fact, it might be nowhere without Christians. It's probable that intellectual pursuits would have died or fallen out of vogue if it wasn't for Christian influence. A desire to understand God's creation led to some of the biggest breakthroughs in the disciplines of natural philosophy. Even anesthesia and syringes came from Christians inspired by the Word of God. So when we see the alleged conflict between science and Christianity, it's important to remember that at the very least, it's complicated, and at worst, it's artificial. Uneducated Christians have had a tough time answering the questions of evolutionists, and they haven't been taught well by the more educated among us. But that's not to say that there aren't a lot of hard hitters in the fields of geology and other disciplines that have done a lot to at least raise questions about that issue. Arguments like those of how the solar system revolves and how Noah's Ark worked were originally had by Christians who believed in the authority of the Bible. And it was typically the disagreements that led to people discrediting the Bible, not the actual content of the Bible itself. So we can see scientific advancement the way some of the original scientists saw it, as man taking dominion back over fallen creation. We can see advances that have been made in medicine as God allowing mankind to take more and more ground away from the dominion of death. And so much technology has been developed that has led to less hunger worldwide, less suffering, less death and brutality. It's hard to deny that the scientific field has been developed with a divine hand at play. All right, everyone, that's it for today's show. It's the longest solo episode ever. I've been working on this one since May, researching it for you guys. Thank you for listening. Sorry this wasn't ready on time last week. It was supposed to be, and then Dottie misfiled some paperwork and, just misplaced some stuff. It's a long story. You know what? I forgive you. I hope that you're not too fatigued with the amount of information I was throwing out. I had a lot of fun working on this episode, and if anything comes up that you think I missed, maybe I can cover that in a future episode. Make sure to donate to Trevor's GoFundMe page. I've been your host, Nick, and I'll be here to do it with you all again next week. Goodbye for now.